Well, it's great to be here today, isn't it? And I'd like to welcome you as well if you're here, if you're out in the atrium, if you're watching online. It's great to be together this 4th of July weekend. You know, most of us are familiar with Harry Potter, right? Well, in the very first movie and book, there's a magical object called the Mirror of Erised. And Harry stumbles on this mirror one day, and as he looks in it, he doesn't see himself, he sees his parents. And which is quite remarkable because Harry's never really met his parents. They died when he was an infant. But in the mirror, he sees them looking at him with admiration and reaching out for him and caring for him. And he's so excited that he runs and he gets his friend Ron Weasley. And he says, Ron, you got to see this. But when Ron looks in the mirror, he doesn't see Harry's parents. He sees himself as this big sports celebrity. He says, look, I'm the head boy. I'm holding the championship trophy. I look good. And later, Harry's mentor explains the magic of the Mirror of Erised. He said, instead of seeing ourselves when we look in that mirror, we see our deepest and most desperate desire. And what they're saying is that when we look in that mirror, when they look in that mirror, they see what they really want in life. When they see it, they say, that's what I need. That's what's going to make me somebody. That's what's going to make me important. That's what's going to give my life significance. Well, what if we had one of those? And we could look into that Mirror of Erised. What would we see? You see, the word Erised is desire spelled backwards. In other words, what is the deepest desire of our lives? And whatever that desire is, oftentimes we would say, if I could have that, if I could get that, if I could be that, then my life would be important. And if we had one, what would you see? What would you see? Whatever that is, we will spend enormous amount of energy pursuing it. We will spend time and money and attention and read whatever that is that's most important to us. And whatever that thing is, we will, I'm going to use a biblical word here, we will worship it. If my deepest and most desperate desire is for a relationship with a specific person, I will worship that person. If my deepest and most desperate desire is some sort of achievement, for a position at work, certain level of income, I will worship whatever that is, that achievement. And whatever I worship will give shape to my life. And that's why we're going to look at Psalm 95 today, because through the course of Christian history, this psalm, more than any other place in the Bible, has been used to teach us about worship. What is it? Why should we worship? How do we worship? And so in your program and on the screens here, I'm going to read the first half of Psalm 95. Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to him. The sea is his, for he made it. His hands formed the dry land. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he's our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. Today, if only you would hear his voice. So why do we worship? Why is this so important? Well, I talk to a lot of people, and one of the comments I often hear is, you know, Dennis, I know a lot of people too, and the person I'm talking to wouldn't consider themselves a Christ follower. They would say, I look at people in my life, there are some in my life who say that they believe what the Christians believe, and I have people in my life that don't believe those things. And when I compare their lives, for many of them, I just really don't see much difference. What good are these beliefs doing? Their lives doesn't really seem to matter. They're just as grumpy, just as mean, just as unkind, just as bigoted as anybody else. Now, to be fair, I could have pointed out to that person, I could give you hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people and show you that their lives have been literally transformed for the better. I could point that out to you. But there still are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people who say they believe these things, but their lives are not much different. What gives? There's a gap between what they say they believe and their character. You know, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament says, look, the fruit of The way it should look in a person who is a follower of Christ is they should have the attributes of love and joy and peace and patience and goodness and kindness and thoughtfulness and gentleness. Why is it that so many people who have these beliefs don't have this character? And here's why. It's because they're missing the spiritual practices and the spiritual habits that will take what we say we believe and drive them deep into the core of our lives. Practices like Bible reading and praying and spiritual friendship and group life, community life, and tithing and giving. And what we're talking about today, worship. And that's why Psalm 95 is so important to us, because it tells us that in order to bridge the gap between our beliefs, our Christian beliefs, and character, there's a pathway, there's a spiritual practice that will help move our beliefs from the surface of our life into our lives. Worship, you can write this down. Worship takes our beliefs about God and drills them deep into the core of our lives. When we see a road construction crew trying to build a road through a mountain, and they need to use explosives, they don't just lay the explosives on the top of the rock, do they? What do? They drill down deep, they put the explosives down there, and when they detonate, it makes a rock into a road. That's how it works. And that's what wholehearted worship does. It takes these dynamite beliefs that are lying on the surface of our lives, and it drills them down into the core of our lives, and then it detonates there. And our lives begin to change. And if we don't regularly worship God or do any of these other spiritual practices that I just mentioned, our lives will be very inconsistent if we call ourselves a Christ follower. They'll be hypocritical. And the worst thing is, we're going to miss out. We're going to miss out on this wholehearted, full-on life with God that He wants for us. So why worship? Because it has transformational power. Question number 2, what is worship? Here's a definition I've read this week. Worship is using your entire person to ascribe ultimate value to something or someone that engages your mind, our body, our heart, our will, our whole being as we do this. You see, worship isn't wholehearted worship unless it engages our whole person. Look at these verses. In verse 1 it says, sing for joy, shout aloud. So wholehearted worship, number 1, is expressed emotionally. Any Bronco fans here? That's kind of weak. Any Bronco fans here? When the Broncos won the Super Bowl last year, what did you do? Are there any Raiders fans here? You could do better than that. Broncos fans, what'd you do when you won the Super Bowl last year? There you go, right there. None of you were seated, right? We were jumping up and down, and I'm a Bronco fan. I mean, we were high-fiving and yelling and screaming and hollering. We're engaged emotionally, right? It's impossible to have a passion about something and at some point not be engaged emotionally. Well, if we can do that for a silly football team, just keeping a little perspective here, what about God? What about when God does something significant in our world? Isn't that worth shouting and yelling and blowing confetti? It is, and that's what he's saying. Look, it engages us emotionally, but then the emotion begins to get channeled, because in verse 2 it says, all that noise takes shapes, it says, to extol God in what? In music and song. There's something about music for many people that just engages us emotionally that words cannot. And some of you go, you know what? The music part of our worship, I'm not really into it. I'm not really musical. I'm kind of a prison worshiper, always behind a few bars looking for the right keys, right? Music is designed to engage our emotion. And that's what wholehearted worship does. It engages our emotion. Here's another quality. Wholehearted worship is expressed physically. In the Psalms, there are a bunch of physical expressions. Singing, shouting, clapping. Here, there's bowing and kneeling in verse 6. There's lifting of hands. There's standing. All of these, we can express our worship physically. Here's another one. Wholehearted worship engages the will. In verse 6, it says, come, let us what? Bow down in worship. Let us kneel before the Lord. You see, bowing are acts of humility and submission. They're acts of the will. And genuine worship moves us beyond emotion, beyond the physical. And it comes to a place where we need to recognize the place of God in our lives. And when we kneel and bow before him, what we're saying to him is, you're God and I'm not. You have the plan, the best plan. My goal is to align my life with your plan. Your will be done on earth, in my life, the way you want it to be. There's a surrender there. And another one, wholehearted worship engages the mind. In verse 7, it says to hear his voice, listen to the words, to the truth, engage our minds, comprehend and understand what he's saying, not ignore his words. Even if we find his words difficult to understand and even more difficult to follow. We used to have this saying, right? We work at our play and what? Play at our work, right? Well, these days it's a little different. Today, we worship our work, we work at our play, and we play at our worship. You see, if you ascribe to the Christian truths with your mind, you go, you know what? I believe this mentally, it makes sense to me, it makes rational sense, but inside you've never really experienced the powerful presence of God. So we'd respond with awe or it would melt us or touch us in some deep way. Then this is a growing area for you. Or maybe we come to church and we fully engage with the music. I mean, we are into it. But when it comes to the sermon, we sort of blow it off, and then when we go to the week, we just, whatever was said or taught on the weekend, we just don't pay any attention because we're looking for that kind of emotional high of worship. We have a place to grow here. Or some of us, we might come to church and go, you know that music part? I'm not really into that. I can come a little late to that. You know, it's kind of the pregame warm-up. But the message, now that's the meat. That's why I go. Well, if we ignore any of these expressions, physical, emotional, mental, or our will, our surrender, it's not going to have the transformational power that the potential is. You know, we'll be just as grumpy, we'll be just as bitter, we'll be just as harsh, we'll be just as fearful, we'll be just as full of worry. But when we begin to engage all four of these together in wholehearted worship, it has the power to transform our lives. I said earlier that worship ascribes ultimate value. What does that mean? Well, there's a three-letter preposition that's used twice in this psalm that gives us the reasons for wholehearted worship. One of them's in verse 3, for. There it is, the three-letter word, for. The Lord is a great God, the great King above all gods, creator of everything we see. And then in verse 6, for, here's another, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care. You know, in verse 3, God is, he's up there. He's out there. He's out there in the galaxies. And he is this great, powerful, amazing, transcendent God, the creator of everything he sees. But God, he doesn't leave God up there in the stars, just out there. In verse 6, it says, this great God comes up close and personal. What does he say? He says, for he is what? Our God. We are the people of what? His pasture. Now we have a place to belong. And the next phrase could be translated, the very sheep in his hand. I'm under the watchful care of this divine shepherd. So last week, a few of us on staff got to go to a conference out in California, LA area, and I got to go down to Laguna Beach morning and evening and go for a walk along there. And I'm kind of a mountain farm boy, and so the ocean, it's just amazing to me. And I would just stand there and watch that surf just come. And how many of you like this moment? You like standing at the ocean. It's just mesmerizing, isn't it? There's something spiritual about standing there. And it was amazing. And waves would crash up on the rocks. And then I got to thinking later, I thought, you know what? As great as the ocean is, it would kill me. If I got in the right spot, right up against the rocks, it would just bash me against the rocks. It wouldn't give a riptide about me, and it would just go on. It would just go on. John 10:14, Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd. This is why this is important. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. You see, power cannot love you. The power of an ocean, the power of nature, the power of the inspiration of a 14er in Colorado or Mount Everest, It doesn't care about you. Could give a rip about you, as I said. A mountain cannot care for you, lead you, cannot make you lie down in green pastures, cannot lead you beside the still waters, cannot show you the paths of the right way of living. Only a divine shepherd can. And when the psalmist says, yes, God is a great God. He's out there and he's big and he's huge and we can worship him for that. But he's also here. He didn't just make power moves in the universe, he made personal moves. He made relational moves. And he says, I want to be your shepherd. I want to hold you in the palm of my hand. He's that close. And that's why worship is so important. God makes this personal move, and it makes him worthy of our worship. So question number 3, then how is it that we worship? If that's who God is, how do we do it? How do we learn to put and keep God as the one who has ultimate value in our lives? And this psalm mentions 3 ways. First of all, we worship together. We worship in community. One of the most conspicuous things is the prepositions. Let us sing. Let us shout. Let us welcome. Let us bow down. There's no let me bow down, let me worship. No, it's all us. Everything is us. I mean, why is that so important? I mean, why can't I just go worship on my own? Worship in the mountains, worship at work, worship when I'm driving. I mean, I'm kind of busy, right? I mean, why do I need to show up here and do it together with other people? Well, C.S. Lewis had 2 very close friends, Ronald and Charles. And when Charles died, this is what Lewis said. In each of my friends, there is something that only some other friend can fully bring out. Now that Charles is dead, I'll never again see Ronald's reaction to a Charles joke. Far from having more of Ronald, having him to myself now that Charles is away, I have less of Ronald. We possess each friend not less, but more as the number of those with whom we share him increases. What Lewis is saying is, when I lost Charles, I figured, now I'm going to have a lot more of Ronald. But he discovered he actually has less of Ronald. Because in order for him to truly know Ronald, he had to see how he would relate to Charles, if he had to relate to Charles. He's saying the more you share a friend with other friends, the more we're going to get to know that particular friend. And if that's true in our human relationship level, can you imagine how much more that would be true in our relationship with God? You'll never truly know God unless we do this together in community. Because I need to see how you think about God, how you react to God, how God interacts with you. That will help me understand who God is. That's why we have this book. It helps us understand how God is related to people all throughout the course of history. And unless we worship in community, unless we pray, praise, study, learn, serve, give together in community, we're just going to miss. Our view of God is going to be so small. I have a friend who says, the mountains are my church. I have another friend who said, her garden is her church. And I think if that's your entire view of God, I would think that you would wonder if you're really worshiping a living God at all. And that's why we gather here every week, why it's so important. 80% of Americans say, I don't have to go to church to be a good Christian. Well, I'm not sure what they mean by good Christian necessarily. I mean, if they mean, I have a relationship with God, I don't need to go to church, that's true. But if what they're saying is, I can be a thriving, growing, healthy, well-related, social, generous person without going to church, I would sincerely question that. I would. The idea that you can be a healthy, thriving follower of Christ without being a part of a local church, it's just not true. It's not true. We need to worship together. Because when we worship together, when we worship the living God, it shapes us, and when it shapes us, it shapes the people around us. So worship God wholeheartedly. It's one of the things we do. We worship together. Here's number 2. We worship God. We worship in God's truth. Here's the question. How does the psalmist know all these things he says about God are true? Maker of everything, over all the how does he know that's true? Just go, well, I think it's true, or because I said it, it makes it true. That's not what's happening. The psalmist has submitted his mind to the Word of God, the Old Testament in his day. Because in the writings of the Old Testament, he could read and see how God revealed himself through history, through his interaction with human beings, people who've come before him. And by submitting to the truth of the Word of God, the self-revelation of God, it just opens up this grand vista now of all the things we can look at in God's interaction with people through the course of history. Now, I know the average Coloradoan would say, I don't buy that. I mean, that Bible, there's some good stuff in it. But it's radical, it's outdated, it's old-fashioned, it's contradictory, and some of the things I read about God in there, well, that just doesn't fit with my idea of who God is. So they take this part of the Bible and that part of Buddhism, that part of culture and that part of the Dalai Lama, and they put it all together and they come up with what I would call a designer God. A God that they would say, I'm comfortable with. Well, Tim Keller says this: if you design a God that fits you and you throw out out of the Christian tradition, out of the Christian scripture, anything you don't like, you have a God who can never fight with you, can never disagree with you, can never outrage you. You will not have a living worship relationship with him. Secondly, you've completely made it impossible for yourself to be a part of a community, especially a Christian community. Because when we come together, you might be here and you go, you know what, I don't really buy this thing yet. I'm curious, I'm open, and that's the best posture. But we're going to say things in our teaching and you're going to go, I don't know. We're going to sing words in a song, you're going to go, I don't believe that. And there's going to be this disconnect in your worship the further we go. And the other thing that's going to happen is, if we create a God that is so small that I'm comfortable with it, guess what you've got? You've got you. You've got you. Because the person who's most comfortable with you is you. And the person, if we make a God the size of us, it's not worth worshiping. And so that's why worship in a community is so important. And if we're open, you might not buy it all, but if we're open to the truths of taking this on and discussing it and drilling down into it and discussing with other people and learning and reading, and some point along the way we're going to go, you know what, that seems to make more sense than less sense, and we come across the line, what's going to happen is it is going to open this grand vista now for you in terms of your worship, because now all of a sudden these things that you wanted if were true, now they've become true in your life, and you can use all these truths to worship God. Wholehearted worship. We can worship God in truth. And here's what happens at the end of all this. One aspect of worship is, number 3, we get to experience the rest of God. And the last part of Psalm 95 is about an incident that happened in the history of Israel. They spent 40 years wandering around in the wilderness, waiting to enter the promised land where they would finally experience true rest. 40 years, every day they'd pack up all their stuff, put it on their back, and carry it on. How many of you backpack? How many of you have been on a 3-week backpacking trip? 6-week back. How many of you have been on a 40-year backpacking trip? If you did that, you would need rest. You would need rest. And that's what he's saying. And because they didn't listen to the word of God at a particular place, Meribah and Massah, their getting into that rest of the promised land was delayed. They didn't experience the full rest of God. And here's the truth about you and me. Every day when we get up, we have an opportunity to either worship God, or we put our lives on our back and we carry them through the day, through the week, through the months, through the years, and we're badly in need of rest. And worship is one of the things that will give us rest, because we understand who God is, his relationship with me, how he feels about me, how he understands me, how he's with me. And when we experience that, it lifts the burden. If we don't do that, we're going to always wonder, am I a good enough person? Am I a generous enough person? Am I a moral enough person? And we carry that load day after day, year after year. And Jesus says, I have a word, a good news for you. All you who labor and are heavy laden, I have come to give you what? Rest. How do we know that that's true? How do we know that that's true? Jesus came to give us rest because we are so valuable to him. Many of you know I grew up on a farm in Wyoming, and one spring I was charged with lambing out, playing midwife, to 1,000 head of mama sheep. They're called ewes, if you don't know the name. Mama sheep is called a ewe. No, ewe. Anyway. And I really wanted to be a good shepherd. I did. So one day I got busy in the barn. It's a cold, blustery, windy day, And I came outside and I looked down. Out the end of the pasture was this mama lamb with 2 little white spots laying beside it. So I got in the pickup and raced down there. And there were these 2 baby lambs just frozen to the ground. And I thought, great shepherd you are. You get distracted, and 2 lambs lose their life because of you. What a great shepherd you are. So I was picking them up and putting them in the back of the pickup. And when I picked up the second one, I heard this. Bleh. And I thought, there's hope. So I threw it in the front, laid it in the front of the pickup. Clunk. Laid it in the front of the pickup, turned the heater on, raced up to my grandma's house, brought it in her kitchen, filled the sink with warm water, and put that lamb right in it. She's used to this thing. And we tried to massage it and warm it up, and then we toweled it off, and it's all clean, but it wasn't any better. Just lethargic and just laid there. I took it back down to the barn, and I built this little room in the barn that had a refrigerator with sheep milk in it, and try milking a sheep sometime. Anyway, sheep milk in it, and I had this little spot with a heat lamp, and I'd line it with hot pink carpet so I could lay it in there and it'd keep it warm, and nothing happened. So then I thought, well, maybe I could feed it some milk. And so I warmed up some milk and fed it a little bit of a bottle, and then I heard this. And I thought, great, first you try to kill him by freezing it to death. Now you pour milk down its lungs. And it just wasn't, I thought, well, maybe the mom would help. So I rounded her up, put her in this little pen in the barn, and put the lamb in there, and she was like amped up. She was like stomping around. I thought, oh man, she's going to kill him. So I brought him out. I had no idea what to do. So I made this little mound of straw over here, and I laid the lamb on the straw. And I thought, well, I've done all I can. And I remember, you know what? I haven't done all I can. And so I walked back over there, and I picked up that lamb, and I just held it in my lap. And I just looked up, and I said, God, I know you got a lot of important things going on in the world today. And there are millions and millions of lambs in the world. But this is my lamb. I care about this one. I'm supposed to be shepherding this one. Would you do something? Would you do something? And that's how God feels about every human being in the world. It's how he feels about you. You're that valuable to him. And so is your neighbor. And so are people who are so far from God, the only time they mention his name is in a swear word. But that's the way God feels. We are the sheep in the palm of his hand. If you ever wonder, does God love me? Am I important to him? Am I valuable to him? Jesus says in John 10, I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep. How do we know Jesus feels that way about us? Jesus came and suffered, and he lost everything. He laid it all down. It was an unbelievable price. Yet in Isaiah 53, there's this little line that says that the results of his suffering he will see and be satisfied. He's going to look at that huge price, all that he paid, and say, it was worth it. It was absolutely worth it. And what is it that he gained from dying on the cross that he didn't have before? You, and you, and you, and you, and you, and all of you, and you, and you, and you, and you. That's what he got. We're that valuable to him. Jesus looks at us and says, you are so worth it. So much so that in Peter it says, we are his treasured possession. And when that truth begins to settle on our souls, we will begin to make him our most treasured possession as well. And when we do that, that's worship. That's worship. And so if you ever wonder, does Jesus really love me? Pay attention. Take another look at the cross. If you ever wonder, is it important to show up here on the weekends and sing these songs, listen to this teaching, and get involved in a life group? Take another look at the cross. Take another look at the cross. Because when we worship wholeheartedly, our souls will find rest. And in case you're wondering what happened to that lamb, I put it back in with his mom, who had calmed down, and I just went out of the barn. And 30 minutes later, I came back, and he was up having his first meal from his mom. It was God's exclamation point of saying, you know what, Dennis? If I care for a stupid sheep. Don't you think I care for you? And so here's how we're going to end our time today together. I'm going to invite the band to come out right now, and we've put together a kind of a worship experience for us. And I just encourage you to enter fully into this. It has a number of different elements, and engage your mind. You know, there might be a phrase of a song or something that you hear that just kind of sticks in your mind. Write it down. Keep it through the week. Maybe it will engage you physically. You know, you might want to stand or kneel or shout or dance. Careful with the dancing. Clap, whatever. You know, engage your body physically. For some of us, it might be, you know what? I got to engage my will on this because I've never surrendered my life to God. I never really have. I never really said to him, I want you to be my shepherd. I know you're his shepherd, her shepherd, their shepherd, but I've never asked you to be my shepherd. And there might be a moment where you submit your will to God. And then, of course, it's our emotions. You know what? If we engage all those others, we're not going to have to worry about our emotions. They will follow. So, A.W. Tozer said this, the litmus test of a true worship is when we come in, we're not asking, what am I going to get out of this? We're asking, what am I going to put into this? And what is God going to get out of this?